In 1981, every fighter jet on Earth obeyed the same trade-off. Speed came from smooth, swept-back metal. Stealth came from awkward radar-absorbing shapes that could barely break the sound barrier. No aircraft engineer alive had built one that did both. The consensus wasn't written down anywhere, because it didn't need to be. It sat in every wind tunnel report, every radar cross-section chart, every design review from Seattle to Fort Worth. An airplane invisible to radar, and an airplane fast enough to outrun a MiG-29 were two different airplanes, built by two different philosophies, and no one had found a way to make them the same machine. Radar didn't care about intentions. It cared about edges. A sharp corner, a straight vertical fin, an exposed engine inlet. Each one threw a signal back to the ground clear enough to put a missile in the air before a pilot ever saw the launch. Every air force on the planet accepted this as physics. It wasn't. It was a habit, one nobody in the industry had been forced to break. One engineer, working in a windowless building half a mile from Northrop's main campus, looked at that habit and decided it wasn't a law at all. His name was John Cashin. He was 36 years old. He had never designed an airplane. For the decade before that, he had chased things the human eye couldn't see. At Hughes Aircraft, he tracked the ionized trail a rocket left as it screamed back through the atmosphere. He studied how radar and infrared sensors picked up a warhead falling through re-entry. He worked ballistic missile defense, teaching machines to find an object in the sky before a human ever could. None of it involved a single rivet, a single wing, a single cockpit. In 1973, Northrop hired him. For a year, he worked on lasers. Then, in 1974, the company handed him a different problem, one no aircraft manufacturer on Earth had solved. Not how to build a faster fighter, not a more maneuverable one. How to build one that radar could not find at all. John Cashin was born in April 1937 in the United States, into a country still climbing out of the Depression, and about to be pulled into a war that would remake American industry from the ground up. The public record does not name his father's occupation or his family's economic position. Those details were never documented, and this account will not invent them. What the record does show clearly is what he did with his education once he had the chance to pursue it. He did not go to college in the ordinary way. From 1960 to 1964, Cashin worked full-time at Bell Labs, the research arm of the American telephone system, and at the time one of the most demanding technical environments in the country, while studying electrical engineering at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. 4 years of night classes stacked on top of a full-time engineering job. He graduated in 1965 at 28, with a bachelor's degree earned the hard way. After the workday ended, not instead of it. Most engineers with a fresh degree took the safe, adjacent job. Cashin took the strange one. Hughes Aircraft hired him straight out of NJIT to study something almost no one outside the missile defense world thought about: the gas dynamics of rocket plumes and the wakes left behind by objects re-entering the atmosphere at hypersonic speed. His job was to figure out how radar and infrared sensors could detect and track those wakes. In effect, to understand how a fast-moving object betrays its own location to the machines hunting it. It was not aviation. It was not even close to aviation. It was the physics of things trying not to be seen, or trying to be seen anyway, depending on which side of the sensor you were building for. The work was good enough that Hughes gave him a fellowship to keep studying while he worked. In 1971, Cashin completed a PhD in electrical engineering at UCLA, 6 years after his bachelor's degree, and entirely on the strength of research he was already doing on the job. At Hughes, that research had two threads that would matter enormously a decade later. The first was tracking the rocket plume of the Surveyor lunar lander, refining how sensors separated a real signal from background noise, tens of thousands of miles from Earth. The second was radar discrimination work for the Hard Sight program, an American anti-ballistic missile effort built around a single brutal problem. When an incoming warhead is surrounded by decoys, how does a radar operator tell which object is real? That question, how do you make a machine correctly interpret what a sensor is and isn't seeing, was Cashin's actual specialty, years before he ever touched an airplane. It is the same question, asked in reverse, that stealth technology exists to answer. A discrimination radar tries to find the one true signal inside a cloud of clutter. A stealth aircraft tries to become the clutter. By 1971, John Cashin had spent his entire professional life on one side of that equation. He did not yet know he was about to be handed the other side of it, and told to solve it for an airplane that also had to fly at twice the speed of sound. The event that pulled John Cashin into aviation didn't happen at Northrop. It happened in the Sinai Desert in October 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, and its shockwaves reached every defense engineer in the United States within months. Israeli fighter bombers, flying some of the most capable aircraft in the world, ran straight into a wall of Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles and radar-guided anti-aircraft guns. In just over 2 weeks of fighting, Israel lost more than 100 aircraft, a rate of attrition that stunned American war planners watching from the Pentagon. The lesson was blunt and impossible to ignore. Modern radar-guided defenses could shred an air force that flew the old way, no matter how fast or well-armed its jets were. Speed and firepower were no longer enough. An airplane needed to not be found in the first place. That lesson landed on Northrop's doorstep as a classified research problem, funded quietly through the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The company was already doing early low observables work, radar-absorbing materials, oddly faceted shapes. But in 1974, a year after Cashin joined the company, Northrop reassigned him from laser research onto that program. He was 37. The technical problem waiting for him was not new to him in substance, only in application. Earlier stealth thinking at Northrop and elsewhere focused on defeating radar from one direction at a time, nose on, the angle a fighter would present while attacking. Cashin's background said otherwise. Years spent on missile defense discrimination, teaching a radar system to find one true object hidden in a field of decoys, had trained him to think about detection as a full-sphere problem, not a single-angle one. A real airplane in real combat didn't just approach a radar site head-on. It banked. It turned. It exposed its belly, its tail, its engine inlets. At every angle a radar operator might be watching from. Cashin argued that a truly survivable aircraft couldn't just hide its nose. It had to manage its radar signature from every direction at once, a much harder problem, because reducing reflectivity from one angle often increased it from another. It was the same trade-off logic he'd spent a decade studying at Hughes, just inverted. Instead of helping a sensor separate a real target from clutter, he now had to help an aircraft disappear into the clutter itself, from any direction an enemy radar happened to be looking. That full-sphere approach to signature reduction became the design philosophy Northrop would carry through the next 2 decades, through Tacit Blue, the strange, flat-sided testbed that validated the concept in the early 1980s, through the B-2 bomber, and eventually through the airplane this story is really about. It started as one engineer's answer to a narrow technical argument inside a classified program. It did not stay narrow for long. By the time the Pentagon came looking for a new fighter to replace the aging F-15, John Cashin was no longer a missile defense physicist who had wandered into aviation. He was the man Northrop would turn to first. By the late 1980s, Cashin's full-sphere signature work had become the technical backbone of Northrop's bid for the Air Force's Advanced Tactical Fighter program, a competition to replace the F-15 with something that could survive against the next generation of Soviet radar and missiles. Northrop's design, built with McDonnell Douglas, would carry his approach further than any aircraft before it, on a jet meant to do something Tacit Blue and the B-2 never had to: fly at supersonic speed while staying nearly invisible. On June 22, 1990, the aircraft rolled out at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Northrop had named it the Black Widow II, after the company's own P-61 night fighter from the Second World War. 2 months later, on August 27, 1990, the first prototype, internally called PAV-1, flew for the first time, with Northrop Chief Test Pilot Paul Metz at the controls. A second prototype, PAV-2, joined the flight test program that October. The airplane looked like nothing else in the sky. It had no vertical tail fins in the conventional sense. Instead, two enormous, sharply angled surfaces splayed outward from the fuselage, a shape Cashin's team had settled on because a slanted, all-moving surface returned far less radar energy than a flat, upright fin standing straight into a radar beam. Diamond-shaped wings blended directly into the fuselage with no sharp seams for radar to catch. The engine exhaust, normally one of the hottest, most radar-visible parts of any jet, was buried and shaped to disperse both heat and reflection before it ever left the airframe. Supercruise, the ability to fly faster than the speed of sound without using afterburner. The fuel-hungry, radar, and infrared bright boost most fighters need to go supersonic, was the aircraft's second defining trait. Within its first year of testing, the Black Widow demonstrated exactly that, cruising supersonically at roughly Mach 1.6 without afterburner, and reaching a top demonstrated speed near Mach 1.8 during test flights, with a design maximum widely reported above Mach 2. No fighter prototype competing for the same contract came close to matching it. By any technical measure Cashin's team could put a number on, the airplane worked. It was, by most independent assessments at the time and since, the stealthier of the two ATF finalists. And it was faster. Air-to-air refueling was achieved by the fourth test flight. Supersonic flight came by the fifth. In under a year, the two prototypes flew roughly 50 test sorties, without a major setback. And still, inside the Air Force evaluation teams reviewing both finalists, a different argument was taking shape. One that had almost nothing to do with radar cross-section or top speed. The objection wasn't that the Black Widow 2 failed to perform. It was that Northrop, as a company, carried more risk. The Air Force's evaluators were weighing two intertwined fears: whether Northrop and McDonnell Douglas could actually manufacture a jet this complex, in the volumes the Air Force needed, on schedule and within budget, and whether the rival team, led by Lockheed, had demonstrated the kind of maturity and agility the service trusted more for a program this large. It was not an unreasonable position. Northrop was, at the time, still absorbing the cost overruns and manufacturing strain of the B-2 bomber program. The same stealth expertise that had produced Cashin's breakthrough was also, in the eyes of some evaluators, evidence of a company already stretched thin. A fighter that was marginally stealthier and meaningfully faster meant little to the Air Force if the company building it couldn't deliver hundreds of them on time. Northrop's counter-evidence was concrete, and it came in three parts. First, radar cross-section. Independent assessments consistently placed the Black Widow 2's signature below that of its rival, across a broader range of viewing angles. The direct result of Cashin's full-sphere approach, rather than a single-aspect fix. Second, sustained speed. No competing ATF prototype matched its demonstrated supercruise performance, a capability that translated directly into range and survivability in a real intercept. Third, growth margin. The airframe's shaping and internal volume left more room for future engine and sensor upgrades than its rival's tighter, more conventional layout allowed. None of it changed the outcome the Air Force evaluators were converging toward. The people weighing production risk over radar returns did not yet know they had already decided the wrong airplane would win the argument that mattered less. The flight test campaign that followed PAV-1's first flight moved at a pace almost no stealth program before it had managed. Air refueling was demonstrated by the fourth flight. Supersonic speed came by the fifth. On October 26, 1990, PAV-2, the Gray Ghost, painted in two shades of gray rather than PAV-1's charcoal, made its own first flight, with test pilot Jim Sandberg at the controls. Northrop now had two prototypes flying in parallel, and the data started coming in fast. It did not come in clean. PAV-2's second flight ended with the left engine malfunctioning, forcing a landing on one engine alone. On November 21st, a blocked air-sense line let pressure build inside the fuel tanks as the aircraft climbed, a problem serious enough that ground control talked the jet down before the tanks reached their structural limits. These were not minor footnotes. They were the kind of incidents that, in a less disciplined test program, could have ended in a lost airframe. Northrop's team worked through them, and PAV-2 settled into reliable service for the remainder of the campaign. By the time both aircraft wrapped up flying in December 1990, the two Black Widow IIs had logged 50 test sorties and 65.2 hours in barely 3 months. On November 29th, the two prototypes flew together for the only time in the entire program. Metz in PAV-1, Sandberg in PAV-2, in formation over the Mojave Desert. The following day, PAV-1 closed out its flight test career with a 6-flight surge and flutter sequence that pushed the aircraft to Mach 1.8, the highest speed it would ever reach. Its flight test program, start to finish, had lasted 93 days. Across the runway at Edwards, a different team was running its own campaign on an entirely different philosophy. The Lockheed-led group, Lockheed paired with Boeing and General Dynamics, had rolled out the YF-22 that same year and flown it for the first time on September 29, 1990, 4 weeks after PAV-1, where Cashin's team had built toward the lowest possible radar signature from every angle. The Lockheed team had built toward agility, thrust vectoring engine nozzles that let the YF-22 point its nose in directions its airframe wasn't yet pointed, a maneuverability advantage no amount of stealth shaping could replicate. Both teams knew exactly what the other was betting on. It was not a contest run in secret from either side. It was two fully formed philosophies of air combat, flown within sight of each other's hangars, headed for the same decision. Cashin's belief, by every account from those who worked with him, was not simply a technical preference. He held, and would say for decades afterward, that raw agility was a fading advantage in modern air combat, that a jet an enemy radar couldn't reliably find in the first place would win more fights than a jet that could outturn a missile after being detected. It was a specific, falsifiable claim about the future of aerial warfare, not a vague statement of pride in his own work. Northrop's whole engineering case for the Black Widow II rested on it. Neither side entered the fly-off with unlimited institutional strength behind it. Northrop, in these same years, was carrying the weight of the B-2 bomber program, the same low observables expertise that had produced Cashin's breakthrough, but also a program running years behind schedule and billions over its original budget, a fact that had drawn sustained congressional criticism throughout the late 1980s. And the ground underneath the entire ATF competition was shifting in ways neither engineering team controlled. The Berlin Wall had fallen in November 1989. The Soviet Union that the advanced tactical fighter was built to outfight was, by 1990, visibly beginning to come apart. A shrinking threat meant a shrinking program. The Air Force's eventual production order for the winning design would be a fraction of what planners had projected when the ATF competition began. Every dollar of production risk now mattered more, not less, because there would be far fewer dollars to spread it across. By December 1990, both jets had flown everything the Air Force asked of them. Both had met the program's technical requirements. And Northrop, coming off the most technically ambitious flight test campaign of its history, was about to be judged on a different set of numbers entirely. Not the ones on Cashin's radar cross-section charts, but the ones on a Pentagon Budget Office's risk assessment. On April 23, 1991, Secretary of the Air Force Donald Rice walked into a press room at the Pentagon to end 18 months of waiting. 2 airplanes had been built, flown, and tested against a shared set of requirements. 2 teams had done everything the Air Force had asked of them. Now only one name would leave the room with a contract. Rice's statement was short, and it was not built on a single disqualifying flaw in either design. Both aircraft, he said, met the Air Force's requirements. The decision came down to something harder to put on a data sheet. Confidence. The Air Force had more confidence in the Lockheed-led team's ability to deliver the aircraft on schedule and within budget, at the production scale the service would actually need. And where the 2 designs traded advantages, Northrop's edge in radar signature and sustained speed against Lockheed's edge, in demonstrated agility, driven by thrust vectoring engines that let the YF-22 point its nose independent of its flight path. The Air Force weighted maneuverability higher. Northrop had not stood still waiting to lose. Through the second half of 1990, program engineers pressed their case in every review that would hear it. Radar cross-section numbers below the rival design across a wider range of angles, supercruise performance no competing prototype had matched. An airframe with more room to grow into future engines and sensors was not a passive argument. It was the same case Cashin's team had been building since the aircraft's earliest design reviews, that in a real intercept, not being found mattered more than outturning a missile after being found. The engineers believed the numbers. The problem was that the decision in the end was not going to be made by engineers alone. Paul Metz, the test pilot who had flown YF-1 on its first flight, and who would later fly the production F-22 as well, making him the only pilot to take both ATF bloodlines into the air for their first flights, put it plainly years afterward. Not everyone in a position to choose a fighter aircraft was an engineer, and Lockheed had understood how to present and market its airframe far better than Northrop had. It was not an accusation of dishonesty. It was an admission that a defense competition is decided by people, in a room, weighing a program's risk as much as an airplane's performance, and that Northrop, coming out of the strained over-budget B-2 program, walked into that room already carrying a credibility problem no radar chart could fix. There was no single official who seized the Black Widow 2 from Northrop out of personal grievance. There was no rival executive settling an old score, no bureaucrat with a documented vendetta. What ended the program was a risk calculation, made collectively, by people who genuinely believed they were choosing the safer path for a service about to shrink its fighter fleet in a world where the threat that justified building it in the first place was disappearing in real time. That is a harder story to tell than a villain. It is also the true one. The mechanism of loss was simple and total. There was no forced stock transfer, no bankruptcy filing, no dollar figure attached to a seizure. Because nothing was seized, there was simply no contract. The Air Force would buy the YF-22, developed into the F-22 Raptor. It would not buy the Black Widow 2. Two prototypes that had flown 50 combined sorties, reached Mach 1.8, and demonstrated a radar signature. The Air Force itself acknowledged was the lowest of the two finalists, would never receive an order for a single production aircraft. For John Cashin, the man who had spent 17 years building the full-sphere stealth philosophy the aircraft embodied, the loss carried no criminal charge, no exile, no dramatic downfall. It carried something quieter and, in its way, harder to dramatize. An airplane he believed was right, by every number he could produce, simply stopped existing as a program. The two prototypes that had flown together over the Mojave Desert on November 29th would never fly again. Metz, reflecting on it decades later, refused to frame it as shame. "Never hang your head in shame about what we did," he said. They had built something that could stand beside anything else in the world, and in many respects exceed it. That conviction did not change the outcome, it simply outlived it. Northrop did not fight the decision publicly for long. There was no lawsuit, no congressional appeal, no attempt to reverse the April 1991 announcement. The two Black Widow prototypes were quietly retired from flight status. PAV-1. The aircraft Paul Metz had flown on its first day, the one that had carried the Black Widow 2 name, and the red hourglass marking Northrop management had ordered removed before the public rollout, eventually went to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, where it remains on permanent display in the Research and Development Wing. PAV-2, the Gray Ghost, fared worse. It sits today outdoors at Northrop's own facility in California, its engines long since removed. Exposed to weather, the aircraft was never designed to endure sitting still. The official record of the decision, as the Air Force presented it in 1991, was clean and procedural. Both aircraft met requirements. The Lockheed team offered greater confidence in program execution. The YF-22 moved forward. What the engineers who built the Black Widow 2 experienced was less tidy. It was the sense of watching a technically superior case lose to a better managed one, not through any single dishonest act, but through the ordinary grinding reality that a defense program is won as much in the review room as in the sky. Metz's own later assessment, that Lockheed simply understood how to present and market its airframe, was not an accusation of wrongdoing. It was closer to a professional autopsy, delivered without bitterness, decades after the fact. There was no financial ruin, no forced resignation, no health collapse to report. That absence is itself the honest shape of this story. Not every institutional loss ends in personal catastrophe, and this account will not manufacture one to fit a more dramatic pattern. What actually happened to John Cashin was quieter and, in its own way, more instructive. He did not leave Northrop. He became chief scientist and vice president for the very program his stealth philosophy had helped make possible in the first place, the B-2 bomber, now moving from development into the most demanding phase of its production. It was pioneering work, he said of those years. Every day was a discovery. The Black Widow 2's cancellation did not end his career. It redirected it back toward the aircraft his full-sphere signature approach had originally been built to serve. His path afterward carried him further still, a stretch as a research leader with Australia's Defence Science and Technology Organization, and eventually his own consultancy, advising on aerospace and defense projects into his later years. There was no single dramatic ending to John Cashin's story, no exile, no ruin. There was a man whose signature achievement never entered service, who kept working anyway, and whose actual legacy would not become clear until long after most people had stopped thinking about the airplane that lost. What did not survive intact was Northrop's independence. The financial and reputational strain of the ATF loss, layered onto the B-2 program's cost overruns, and a shrinking post-Cold War defense budget, pushed the company toward consolidation rather than collapse. In 1994, Northrop merged with Grumman to form Northrop Grumman, a restructuring driven by the same industry-wide contraction that had made the Air Force so risk-averse about a smaller manufacturer in the first place. The company that had built the Black Widow 2 did not disappear. It became something larger, carrying Cashin's stealth philosophy with it into a defense industry that was rapidly consolidating around a handful of prime contractors, big enough to absorb exactly the kind of program risk that had cost Northrop the ATF contract. The engineering philosophy John Cashin spent nearly 2 decades building did not die with the Black Widow 2. It kept working, inside programs the public wouldn't fully see for years. The first was already flying by the time the ATF competition ended. The B-2 Spirit, the bomber Cashin had been named chief scientist for in 1982. 9 years before the YF-23 lost its contract, entered service with the United States Air Force in January 1997. 21 were built. It remains, decades later, one of the most capable stealth aircraft ever fielded, and Cashin is listed as one of 3 Northrop engineers holding the aircraft's patent. The full-sphere signature management approach he had argued for since his earliest years on the ATF program, the same philosophy the Air Force's evaluators had ultimately weighed against Lockheed's agility and found less decisive, was built directly into the B-2's flying wing shape, described by radar engineers as the closest achievable form to an infinite flat plate, a surface with almost nowhere for a signal to reflect back from at all. The second program came decades later, and by then Cashin was no longer part of it. In October 2015, the Air Force awarded Northrop Grumman the development contract for a new stealth bomber, the B-21 Raptor, intended to eventually replace both the B-1 and the B-2 in service. John Cashin had retired from Northrop in 1993 as chief scientist and vice president, 22 years before that contract was signed. He had no design role in the B-21, no seat in its engineering reviews, no hand in the aircraft that would carry his low observables philosophy into a new generation. The company unveiled the first B-21 publicly on December 6, 2022, and flew it for the first time on November 10, 2023. A program built by engineers who, in many cases, had not yet been born when Cashin first argued that radar signature mattered more than raw agility. The third piece of his legacy was smaller and stranger. Long after the YF-23 itself stopped flying, its shape kept working, not as a weapon, but as an image. The diamond wing airframe and slanted V-tails Cashin's team had built to defeat radar became recognizable enough to outsiders that the aircraft turned up repeatedly in films, video games, and military models over the following decades. An unusual second life for a jet that never received a single production order. The Air Force had judged the design on production risk and confidence. Popular culture judged it purely on how it looked, and kept choosing it. There was no dramatic seizure to reconcile, no factory renamed by the institution that had taken it. But there was a quieter version of the same gesture. In September 2013, 22 years after the ATF decision, and 20 years after Cashin's retirement, Northrop Grumman published a commemorative book on the B-2 program, timed to the Air Force's designated year of the B-2. The company built its account of the aircraft's stealth breakthroughs directly around Cashin's own recollections. It was pioneering work, he told them. Every day was a discovery. The institution that had absorbed his ATF loss into a broader company restructuring now held him up as the origin story of its most celebrated aircraft, the honor arriving decades after the program that had actually made his name public. What happened to Northrop's stealth infrastructure after 1991 was not destruction. It was consolidation into something larger and, eventually, more dominant than the company that had lost the ATF contract. The 1994 merger with Grumman folded the Black Widow II's engineering lineage into a single, larger prime contractor, one now positioned, 3 decades later, to win the B-21 contract outright rather than compete for it against a rival team the way Cashin's generation once had. The company that had been judged too great a production risk to trust with America's next fighter became, within a generation, the company the Air Force trusted with its next bomber. The corporate and technical through line from the Black Widow II to the present day runs through exactly the chain of names this format promises, and every one of them is real. Northrop Corporation, the company that built the YF-23, merged with Grumman in 1994 to become Northrop Grumman, a restructuring driven by the same shrinking, consolidating post-Cold War defense industry that had made the Air Force so wary of trusting a single mid-sized contractor with the ATF program in the first place. Northrop Grumman carried Cashin's stealth engineering culture forward through decades of B-2 production and sustainment. Then in October 2015 won the development contract for the B-21 Raptor outright, not as an underdog challenger this time, but as the incumbent the Air Force trusted most with the next generation of low observable strike aircraft. The B-21 flew for the first time on November 10, 2023 at Edwards Air Force Base, the same test range where PAV-1 had first left the ground, 33 years and 2.5 months earlier. With Cashin's original full-sphere signature philosophy built into an airframe he had no hand in designing. Was he right? The honest verdict runs in his favor, though not cleanly. Cashin's specific claim that in future air combat, not being detected would matter more than winning a turning fight after detection did not win the argument that decided the ATF contract in 1991. The Air Force weighted the YF-22's demonstrated agility higher than the Black Widow II's radar advantage, and Lockheed's team, by every surviving account including that of Northrop's own chief test pilot, simply ran a more convincing program review. But the trajectory of every stealth aircraft the U.S. Air Force built afterward tells a different story than the 1991 press conference did. The F-22 that beat the Black Widow II still carried extensive low observable shaping of its own. Lockheed's team never argued that stealth didn't matter, only that agility mattered enough to be worth the signature trade-offs it cost. The F-35 that followed leaned further into signature management than maneuverability. And the B-21, the aircraft actually being built today by the company that lost the ATF contract, is a low observable flying wing descended in a straight technical line from Cashin's B-2. Not from anything resembling the YF-22's approach at all. The industry did not reject his argument. It absorbed it slowly into every stealth aircraft that came after the one that lost. The clearest way to see what separated the two ATF finalists is to set their philosophies side by side. Cashin's approach to the Black Widow II was a philosophy of subtraction. Remove every angle, every edge, every hot exhaust plume a radar or an infrared sensor could seize on, until the airplane had as little to detect as physics would allow. Even if that meant sacrificing some measure of within visual range maneuverability. The Lockheed team's approach to the YF-22 was a philosophy of addition. Keep the signature low, but add thrust vectoring engines, added mechanical complexity, and added performance envelope. No radar-optimized shape could match. betting that an enemy who did find the jet would still lose the fight that followed. Both philosophies produced real, flying, technically excellent airplanes. Only one of them produced the aircraft the Air Force actually wanted to build in 1991. 3 decades later, the aircraft the Air Force chose to build next looked far more like the one it had rejected. The Black Widow II never fired a shot, never deployed to a single base, never flew a single operational sortie beyond the 50 test flights that proved it could do everything Northrop said it could. It sits today in 2 places. One intact under museum lights in Dayton, Ohio, honored as a research artifact. One outdoors in California, stripped of its engines, exposed to the exact weather its radar-absorbing skin was never designed to survive sitting still in. Both versions of that ending are true at once, and neither cancels the other out. The Air Force chose the airplane that could turn faster. History chose the shape that couldn't be found at all.